Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's Connect and Explore webinar. I'm Todd Phillips of FHI 360. I direct the Coordinating Center for the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research, known as NCCOR. And NCCOR is a collaboration among CDC, NIH, USDA, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're excited that so many of you could join us, and I'm going to turn the webinar over to our moderator, Elaine Arkin.
Thanks, Todd. I'm delighted to be a part of this today as a member of the NCCOR Coordinating Center. Today's program will include a spotlight segment on the just published Second Lancet Series on obesity. The first series was really successful and featured the research of several NCCOR members and contributors from 4 different countries. So today we'll look at this just released second series and then have a one-on-one panel so that you will have an opportunity to ask our presenters questions. And we'll also be looking at what's next from NCCOR, a few announcements for you. Now, just before we get started, if you have a question or need technical assistance during today's webinar, let us know by using the chat box on the left of your screen. If you're having trouble logging in but can hear us on the phone, you can email us at NCCOR, that's NCCOR, at FHI360.org. That's NCCOR at FHI360.org. And we'll work with you to resolve the problem and get you on the webinar. And we'll also be live tweeting during today's webinar. If you're on Twitter or other social media, we encourage you to join the conversation by using the hashtag ConnectExplore. Now, our guests today include authors from the series. First, Dr. T-K Huang, who's a professor in the School of Public Health at the City University of New York and one of the founding members of NCCOR. And Dr. Boyd Swinburn, who has graciously consented to join us very early in the morning from New Zealand. He's a professor of population nutrition and global health at the University of Auckland and the Alfred Deakin Professor and co-director at WHO's Collaborating Center for Obesity Prevention at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Also, we're happy to have Dr. Tracy Orleans, senior scientist at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Now, Tracy's also a founding member of NCCOR and active on NCCOR's steering committee. She played a key role in the development of the first Lancet series on obesity and will highlight the series' connection to NCCOR and its activities. A champion behind the second Lancet series, Dr. Swinburn will provide an overview of the second Lancet series, including the reasons for patchy progress and high-priority actions that can be taken by governments and industry to aid obesity prevention. And then building on Dr. Swinburn's presentation, Dr. Huang will provide an in-depth look at how we can rethink obesity prevention by mobilizing public support and popular demand for obesity prevention activities. Now, one last thing before we get started, please know that the presenters' views are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of NCCOR or any of its funders. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Orleans for a brief introduction to the Lancet series on obesity. Tracy?
Thank you very much, Elaine. I'm really delighted to be here. As everybody on the call knows, obesity is not just a national problem, but a global problem. Overweight and obesity have increased globally, with only some regions in the world experiencing population stabilization of body mass index. While a few developed countries have seen a slowing in the rise of obesity over the past decade, no country has yet seen a significant reduction in obesity levels among adults or children. Since 1980, we've seen a staggering 47, almost 50% increase in obesity among children globally. no surprise that at least 2.8 million people die each year as a result of being overweight or obese, given these statistics. And of course, as we know, diet-related risk factors and physical inactivity are major contributors globally to the rise in obesity. NCCOR has a successful history in exploring international efforts to further progress. In 2006, almost 10 years ago now, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation launched the Childhood Obesity Modeling Network, COMNET, a team of international researchers who examined childhood obesity drivers and interventions in 4 developed countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. COMNET became a core NCCOR project in 2010 with additional leadership and support from the NIH Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research and Eunice Shriver Institute for Children's Health and Development. The COMNET team published its first Lancet series on obesity in 2011. In 2014, NCCOR and RWJF convened 18 leading international and interdisciplinary researchers for a Lessons Learned from Global Efforts Forum to harvest the findings of COMNET and other global childhood obesity prevention research initiatives. And just last week, the second Lancet series on obesity was published. As many of you know, the first Lancet series featured 4 papers and related commentaries from NCCOR's COMNET modeling teams, again in the U.S., UK, Australia, and Canada. The new Lancet series on obesity prevention builds on the groundwork laid by the first series, which outlined the reasons for the rise in childhood obesity, projections for the future, and identified specific actions needed to reverse the trend, focusing on the need for addressing the upstream drivers of childhood obesity, adult obesity prevention, and reversal. Next slide. NCCOR and the Lancet worked to promote these findings to a ready global audience. More than 630 news articles were published worldwide on the first series. Media highlighted rising obesity rates, the need for government intervention, and actions that governments could take. The series continues to be widely referenced and used by policymakers, researchers, and public health practitioners. And it has spurred the path or paved the way for the second Lancet series on obesity.
Sorry.
Did you get? Okay. Okay, here we are. Sorry, I just lost count of my slides there. Published just last week. The second Lancet series has already garnered impressive media attention. And as you will hear today in the comments by Dr. Swinburn and Huang, the Lancet series provides a critical lens for re-examining the state of obesity, not just in the U.S., but globally. So it's really timely and exciting to have the authors on board. Titled Rethinking Obesity Prevention, this new issue sets the stage for the next phase of global work to reverse the rise in obesity among children and adults. I'm delighted, without further ado, to turn the table over to you, Dr. Swinburn, to tell us about this next issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tracy, and also thanks very much to NCCOR for the support that they've given to these groups as we go through this work with Lancet. So the success of the first Lancet series was a major driver for Lancet and for us to start work on the second series. So it's taken several years to get to this point, but we're very pleased to have launched series last week, as Tracy said. The series looked at trying to understand what's happened in the last 10 years, going back to 2004 when WHO published the Global Strategy on Diet, Physical Activity and Health. And really, from a global look, it was pretty clear that while some progress had been made, it was pretty patchy. Some countries, some strategies, but certainly not the comprehensive approach that we would be hoping for. So we looked to try to understand what some of those reasons are, and that's in the first paper. We also looked at trying to reframe obesity to try and get it into a space where it will get more traction. One of the interesting things that we found when we were plugging these gaps from the first series and developing these papers was that obesity is a very complex area, but we tend to bring it down to a series of dichotomies, the sort of upstream versus downstream, individual versus collective responsibility, regulatory versus non-regulatory, and so on. So we did examine the intersection of some of these dichotomies, and that's where some of this rethinking has come from. We take a look at other potential levers, not just regulatory, but also non-regulatory and quasi-regulatory approaches, and we identify some high priorities for actions and also ways of rethinking obesity. So let me just quickly give you an overview of these papers. The first paper by Christina Roberto and colleagues gives a bit of an overview of this patchy progress and some of the reasons for it, gives an overview to the series, and then it dives down into this particular dichotomy of personal or individual choice and responsibility versus environmental influence. And the insight that they gained from joining those two was really around an exploitation of vulnerabilities. So humans have biological and psychological and social and economic vulnerabilities, and it's where those get exploited is where we have the problems that we have in overeating and under-exercise and obesity and so on. Corinna Hawkes takes a look at food policy, and the dichotomy that they were trying to unpick was this issue around supply and demand. Why have we got an environment that is full of unhealthy food? Is that because that's what's supplied, or is that because that's what gets demanded? And as you might expect, the answer is a bit of both, but it really comes down to, at a practical level, this issue of preferences and the development of preferences, taste preferences at an early age, and therefore the solutions in the space become around protecting those preferences to make sure that they're protected for healthy foods. You'll hear a lot more from T-K Huang about the bottom-up type of approach. Most of us in our discussions talk about a regulatory approach or government-led approach, but Terry really dives into the whole bottom-up approach. Tim Lobstein and colleagues looked at childhood obesity and joined up with colleagues from low and middle income countries and really crystallized this understanding now that's coming through that we really must join up these undernutrition and overnutrition worlds. Essentially, we're dealing with the same food environment and food system processes, and we must together be dealing with malnutrition in all its forms. So I think that's really a call to action to join those worlds. Bill Dietz and colleagues looked at treatment and their priorities and how that might link to prevention and the synergies between treatment and prevention, and also looked very hard at our medical and health professional training and the need to be able to reduce bias amongst health professionals in dealing with people with obesity. And then lastly, the last paper is one that I led on accountability systems, so making that shift from that conceptual shift from responsibility, which is a one person or a one organization dynamic, to accountability, where one actor is accountable to another for actions taken, and that shifts the whole dimension into power and holding to account. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of the contributors and authors to the second series. There's a whole bunch of authors there that you see, and they've all contributed, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to now spread this out and think of and engage other countries, not just the wealthy countries. So one of the main reasons for the limited progress in obesity prevention has been the absence of pressure from civil society. It's been very much an elite health professional-driven pressure. And to talk about this more specifically, I'd like to turn it over to T.K Huang, who is the leader of one of the papers dealing with this specifically. Terry.
Thank you, Boyd. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Let the moderators know if my voice becomes a problem. I did have some audio issues earlier. So I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar. Thank you so much to the NCCOR coordinating team for putting together the webinar, and to all of you attendees for being here with us. So this paper is really about how we can figure out ways to bring the public back into public health. How do we, as a public health field, do a better job of connecting the to the policy actions that we've been studying and championing over the years. And as Boyd pointed out earlier, the entire series is really about moving beyond these entrenched dichotomies on all fronts. And this particular paper is trying to go beyond the dichotomy of, whether it's, personal responsibility only, or is it industry only, or is it government only? We try to put together a framework that really hopes to create a more integrated lens through which we can become more solution-oriented, not just problem-oriented. So the overview of the paper, I'll just very, very quickly go over these. At the outset of the paper, we tried to look at political science and other social science frameworks to inform us on how we can more effectively build public demand. We then look at examples from both within public health and outside public health to try to better understand, as authors, the issues at heart, and then to come up with recommendations for the obesity prevention field. As part of the solution platform, one of the key tables in the paper, which we don't have time to go into a lot of details on today, but if you pick up a copy of the paper, you'll see that we specifically thought through how we can engage a much more diverse set of actors from different sectors, both the public and the private side, to get these sectors involved in creating popular demand. So much like what Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been doing in championing a culture of health, this is a similar idea, and paper kind of prescribes some key and specific actions that each sector can take to create that demand from the bottom up. And then close the paper with some research recommendations for the kinds of implementation and scale-up research that we could potentially all do more of in order to do a better job at mobilizing popular demand. So one of the key political science frameworks that we looked at in our paper was Kingdom's multiple streams framework. And very quickly, I think from our vantage point as authors of this particular paper, we felt that a lot of the public health research has primarily focused on identifying the problem stream in the last 10 years or so, articulating what the policy stream might look like. So with the various policy recommendations that leading organizations are now, I think, all cohering around. But what has been missing for the most part is really a focus on the politics stream. And the politics stream is so critical, one stream that connects the problem and the policy and make it happen. So by focusing the politics stream and looking at the social science literature in this area, as well as key examples, as I mentioned, from both inside and outside of public health, we identified four broad areas of strategies that can potentially help drive up the demand for policy action to prevent obesity. The first is around the identification and prioritization of key issues and refining and streamlining the messages around those issues. So there's, in my view, there's been sort of a cacophony of messages around obesity, healthy diet, physical activity, so on and so forth, and there's not really any sort of centralization of the messages or active management of those messages. And furthermore, I think we still have a long ways to go in terms of identifying the most effective frames of obesity that will have traction with the different segments of the public to get the public to care about this issue. The second broad strategy is around media advocacy, and I'll go into each of these a little bit more in detail in subsequent slides. The third strategy is around how we can be more actively engaged in cultivating citizen engagement as a public health field. And then last but not least, I think there are some core strategies around how we can actually develop a receptive political environment overall to strengthen our ability to push for policy change. So I already talked a little bit about the issue of identifying frames and streamlining messages. In looking at the literature, I was really struck by how little research there has been on public opinion around obesity and obesity-related policies. There have been a few papers in recent years that tested, some messaging frames around obesity, and I think that type of public opinion research, is absolutely critical. We don't have a very good way of tracking these normative changes throughout the country with regard to people's support, with people's recognition of obesity as a problem, in part where consumers are or voters are. Vis-a-vis our policy goals, then we're not going to be able to, in my view, make a very deep dent on some of these policy pushes. And so some of the findings that we have been able to glean in the literature, for example, shows that there are frames that are not necessarily obesity specific, such as military readiness, which can actually create greater traction, with certain segments of the population. So this type of research, I think, gives us an opportunity to tap into a range of social values and partner potentially with other social movements that different groups in society actually care more about, and then use those as an entry point to get people to care about the types of policy solutions that we want to champion for obesity prevention. I already mentioned the problem of the sort of multiplicity and inconsistency of messages over time. This includes a range of recommendations and public health strategies that we put out there, which understandably, science evolves and changes, and so sometimes we don't articulate these strategies as consistently as we could. But I think even more important, the issue, I think, is that when we look at other grassroots campaigns across fields, the ability to actively manage these messages is absolutely critical. And right now, that remains a gap in the obesity prevention infrastructure at large. And then other types of information that I think would be very, very useful in terms of refining and streamlining include information on practices both in the public sector as well as in the private sector, so that the public can have a better understanding of what happens behind the veil. And last but not least, this actually relates to both messaging, but more broadly speaking in terms of media advocacy. How do we actually study, identify, and test out different types of the social and culturally relevant messages that are truly transformative in emotional appeal? That, I think, is something that we can still do a lot on in terms of improving the way we connect with the public. So just segueing now into kind of some additional issues around media advocacy, apart from just not having a very good sense of the public pulse around what is emotionally appealing. That's, I think we can all agree in public health, that's not an expertise area that we have really mastered. But there are other things that I think we need to really think about. So how do we really create a broad enough and deep enough platform to really make this happen? One of the things that we talked about in the paper is, do we need to all kind of take a step back and think about how we can pool our resources across different organizations, maybe even across countries, of actors that are interested in this issue, and by pooling our resources, we might be able to actually have enough resources to take this type of advocacy to scale. After all, the public health budget for social marketing pales in comparison with the kind of budget that is available in the commercial sector. Other things that I think are important include better usage of the digital platform. More and more young people are using digital technology. That's how they're getting a large amount of the commercial marketing. And so how can we leverage the relatively cheaper costs associated with digital platforms in public health in order to create this kind of a grassroots campaign? Again, that's something that I think we need to explore more in the obesity prevention field. So third, around citizen engagement, again, I think that we haven't really looked at different kinds of framing beyond healthy eating, active living, this type of very, I would say, directly health-based type of public communication strategies. But there may be other frames that are really important. So for example, if it's called for, if companies are using, for example, false health claims, on some of their products, could that potentially be used as a rallying point to drive citizen protests, to engage people in the policy discourse? These are things that I think we need to study, but also actively identify, what is prevailing in the social and political discourse, and we have to learn to take advantage of these contemporary debates. And again, there are a lot of lessons that can be drawn from political campaigns in the typical, political sphere around how audiences and voters are organized, both online and offline. And I think that we, those of us that work in the obesity prevention world, need to tap into that type of a grassroots expertise and think about our audience, as broad as all the American voters that are out there, and how we can actually use the power of the voters in order to take home take home some of the policy goals. I often joke with my public health students that, especially around election time, that instead of sitting in my class listening to my lecture, they should be out there, getting voters to the voting booth. And I only say that sort of half facetiously, but it's true that as public health scientists and practitioners, we often don't think about that as being within the realm of our public health work yet, unless we actually support or demand that health, not just healthcare, is part of the political agenda, and then support political candidates that will actually support, champion those policy goals, then we're not going to be able to get very far in terms of adopting and implementing the policy strategies that public health is advocating for. So that brings me to kind of the last broad domain of strategy, which is really about how we actively create this receptive political environment. And when we look at the grassroots strategies in a variety of fields, whether that's gay rights movement or other social issues, we find that the successful movements actually have very carefully deliberated, very strategic ways of putting in place the infrastructure to actually shift the political landscape. And one of these strategies is really about how you match resources, financial or otherwise, with your communication platform, and also with the sort of legal platform for the use of litigation, as one of the strategies. And I think, for us as a field, we position to think about how we can actually integrate, these various spokes, of a backbone organization that is critically needed at this juncture in time is really, really important, because short of that infrastructure that can truly mobilize the public and lobby the broader political sphere, we're not going to be able to really take this next step forward. So some of the other issues within this particular basket of strategy include the need to actually actively cultivate and diffuse change agents across sectors. So I work in a public health school, and often I think about, well, how can I actually train a cadre of new public health graduates that can be systematically and strategically placed in different sectors so that we have change agents in all sectors in society, not only in public health agencies, not only in academia, but in all other sectors and industries as well. And I think that is hugely important. And then last but not least, I talked already a little bit about how to leverage other social movements. Again, we've talked about this frequently in the last few years, but I don't think we've really embarked on this journey in earnest. But I think it's really important that we actually act on opportunities to work across different policy areas or policy regimes, whether it's environmental sustainability or other social movements that are out there that have traction with different parts of the community. I think we really need to actively build those bridges and think of creative ways to channel the messages and the resources in a unified way so that we can actually create that synergy in mobilizing the public. Okay, so I'm running a little bit over, so I'm going to move a little fast. So one, I think, really interesting example to look at in the paper is the Mexican Alliance for Dietary Health, which has been really, really successful in bringing together a lot of different organizations, academic, civil society, government, so on and so forth. And it's a great, there's a panel in the paper that talks about how this particular coalition was very effective in creating a unified platform to mobilize the Mexican public, and they used many of the strategies that I talked about today, such as media advocacy, in order to centralize, manage, and get those messages out. And it was also very clever in the use of endorsements from highly visible celebrities and politicians to drive home the point. And we all know that the tax policies were successfully passed by the Mexican Congress in spite of a conservative government in Mexico. And preliminary studies have actually shown a 10% decrease in sales of tax items and a 7% increase in sales of non-tax products, which I think is so interesting because this actually creates another entry point into a potentially productive conversation between the public and the private side, because if at the end of the day we can show that these policies will generate public health revenues for a lot of the public health prevention initiatives, but at the same time doesn't necessarily mean that private companies have to lose money in the process of supporting this kind of approach, then we might be able to find some new grounds where we can go beyond, again, the dichotomy of black or white solutions, but what could be a set of strategies implemented together that can be supported by a broad coalition of actors. So I won't go into this slide too much in the interest of time, but in the paper we have a table that actually outlines a good dozen sectors and with recommended strategies for each sector. And contrary to previous publications on these sort of expanded coalition that are calling more for what each sector can do policy-wise, our paper is focused on what each sector can do in driving the bottom-up strategy. And I already talked a little bit about the research opportunities, the need to really do more research around public opinions on identifying obesity frames, but also, continued evaluation of policy implementations as they happen can also be fed back to the effort to mobilize public demand. So in summary, I think that we are in a really critical juncture in learning from political science and global case studies to really advance how we can do a better job mobilizing the public for obesity prevention. We absolutely need to prioritize and cohere around specific policy goals. One of the challenges of public health we have is there's so many things that we're pushing for, advocating for, but there aren't enough resources to all of those things at once. So what are the top two or top three, policy goals that we can all cohere around, say, in the next 5 years? That's, I think, a critical question that I don't necessarily have the answer for, but as a field we need to think about. Obviously, developing policy frames, not just health frames, but policy frames, and actively managing media, very, very important. And how can we centralize the infrastructure to do this is critical next step. And we need to invest in building a backbone organization to support this broader coalition of actors with delegated actions. And again, activating and placing a network of change agents across sectors. So to conclude, I would just say that this paper is really about how we actually bring the public back into the policy process and the policy debate. And I hope that as a field, this paper provides a foundation to stir our thinking in terms of how we can do a better job at that. I will now turn over to Boyd again, because he's going to just quickly talk about how some of the issues around the creation of accountability systems, which in my view constitute one really important tool in this effort to mobilize public demand. So, Boyd?
Okay, thanks, Terry. And just quickly, because we're running a bit behind time, but in the paper, in the sixth paper on accountability, we have a framework for accountability about taking the account, which is the monitoring, and communicating the account, which is getting that information out, which researchers are quite familiar with, but we have some suggestions there. The third part of the framework is holding to account, which is the toughest part because that relates to power relationships. And the next two slides are extracted from a table where we take examples, for example, of how civil society can hold governments to account through a variety of mechanisms. And the ones we tend to use are the legal ones, submissions to inquiries and submissions in the policy development process and so on, and the public communications through the media. But there are a number of others that we probably need to strengthen, and in particular we emphasize in the paper the quasi-regulatory approaches. So in other words, that's strengthening codes of conduct, ensuring conflicts of interest managed well within government processes, transparency, and so on. So civil society has a key role in strengthening those components which turn the guidelines and codes of conduct into things which are actually upheld. In the next slide, we consider the role of civil society and how it can hold the private sector into account. And again, a similar sort of list of priorities, and this is just a shorthand for some of the mechanisms. And again, the idea of invoking the industry's own codes and pledges and ethical guidelines and making sure that in civil society we measure those, we monitor them, we communicate them, and hold them to account through public scrutiny. The shareholder activism, which people will be familiar with, public communication, again through the media, and private communication, talking to them personally. So in the paper, in the accountability section, the toughest part of the accountability cycle is holding to account, and that because that's a power relationship, and what we've tried to do here is to articulate some of the ways that this might be done for civil society, strengthening its relationships, I guess, with private sector and with government. So with that, that's the end of the presentations, and thank you for that, and I'll just hand back to Terry.
Thank you, Boyd. So here's the contact information for Boyd and myself. So if anybody wants to follow up to discuss the papers or the series further, we're happy to engage with you. I think we can move on to questions. So I'll hand it over to Elaine.
Thank you both, Terry and Boyd. That was just wonderful, and we could probably spend another hour discussing this, but just to get started, we are going to give you an opportunity, those of you listening in, to ask a question of Terry, Boyd, or Tracy. If you will type your questions into the chat box on the left. And just to get started, while we are giving you a chance to pose your questions, Boyd, this one's for you. What other key insights can this series offer researchers as well as public health practitioners? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think a number of the papers do emphasize the important role of health professionals in public health professionals in this space, and also medical practitioners. Bill Dietz's paper in particular talks about the role of health professionals and the medical professional as leaders in this space. So I think we have a lot to do. We have our own jobs. We are in academia, or we're working in the community and so on. But we probably need to be a little bit more activist and active as joint members of civil society, as Terry said, to be able to really lift that movement. A couple of other things which we haven't particularly talked about. I think the concept in the food policy paper of Corinna Hawkes is, I think it's critical to understand this idea of food preferences and protecting healthy food preferences from market intrusion with young people and with vulnerable people. So I think that allows then people to satisfy healthy food preferences. And Corinna's paper actually also dissects food policies around their expected impact. So they're not all homogeneous. They don't have effects across the whole society. So it's being much smarter about food policies. I think the priority also that's come out of the childhood obesity paper is the primary importance to act on restricting marketing of unhealthy foods to children. That came out as a top priority in that paper. But some of the other themes we have already touched on, so I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you. It certainly makes us want to go read those papers, Boyd. And let's go on to another question. Terry, are there other case studies that the public health community should be looking at as examples of how we could mobilize public support for obesity prevention efforts? I know you showed us a Mexican case study.
Right. Sure, I'll try to be brief. So another example that we highlighted in the paper is around the treatment action campaign. So this is a case study around the HIV and access to care in South Africa in particular. And so, again, it's a public health field, but outside of obesity, yet there are, I think, very important lessons for how a political campaign was built, from the ground up, but with very strategic tactics at the top organizationally in order to get to the policy goal of providing greater HIV care access, particularly among the South African poor. Some other examples, there are actually a lot of examples throughout the paper. That was one thing that the journal really, really wanted all of the authors across all papers to do, is to bring as many examples as possible. But some other examples in the paper include, for example, some of the key lessons we learned in Europe around the Healthy Cities movement. There's a little case study around how Slovenia achieved a national food and nutrition strategy ahead of its accession into the EU. So numerous examples in the paper, but I'll leave my response there for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. We have another question here, and this one is back to you, Boyd. What are some of the other ways that accountability can play a role in creating healthy food policies and environments?
So, yes, let me just take an example of that. The accountability framework, the first part is around taking the account. So what do we measure? And there's a call in it to shift our measurements upstream, to start measuring not just BMI and behaviours, but to shift up into environments, into policies, into policy implementation, and so on. So what we measure makes a difference, and there's a call to shift that upstream. And number two, around sharing the account, how do you share it? How do you get that out? And just publishing a paper and getting in the academic literature is really not enough to get it out there. And I would just like to point to also a commentary in the series by Kelly Brownell and Christina Roberto about the the idea of strategic science, and I encourage people to read that commentary because that fits in very well with his accountability framework. What is it exactly we're measuring? Who's asking the questions? Who wants to know the information? How do we translate that information? So I think there are some key messages in there for researchers to make their research more relevant and accessible to decision makers.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And again, if you have a question, if you could type it into the chat room, we'll be glad to share it with our panelists. I see there's one here. I think this one's for Terry. Terry, counter-marketing has been proven effective in tobacco control, and it's recognized as an evidence-based strategy by CDC and others. So do you see a role for counter-marketing campaigns in building support for policy changes on food?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if I necessarily have the definitive answer to it, because obviously food is a lot more complex. Tobacco is about one product and one behavior that is not essential to survival, but food is, and food is much more heterogeneous so the definition for what is good and what is bad is often much more difficult a line to draw compared to tobacco. I think we need to actually test this, this idea of counter-marketing. It's not clear to me what kind of counter-messaging would work best, and this could very well vary also from context to context, population to population. But the reality is we haven't really done very much of this kind of research. And here's a really great, research question that can be hypothesis-driven, and I think we need to explore.
And that makes a lot of sense. It's not so easy as just taking the evidence base from another public health topic. So that's a good way to charge a path forward. So we have another question that's come up. Tracy and Boyd, we've received a question for both of you, and that's about what do you see going forward as the next priorities for obesity prevention? Tracy, let's start with you.
Well, let me start with an obvious one. Thanks, Elaine. And that is that we really need to look, global problems demand global solutions, but we really need to look outside of our own boundaries to accelerate our learning about the systems level strategies and solutions that are going to roll back the clock or roll back the curve on the rise in childhood and adult obesity. As some of you know, the Foundation just hosted a global session here, Lessons Learned from Global Efforts on Reversing Childhood Obesity Prevention. And we used our Building a Culture of Health framework, which Terry mentioned briefly, to organize those findings. I recommend to any of you on the phone interested in expanding your contacts and ideas around what we can learn from global strategies, that you take a look at that report, which should soon be available on NCCOR's website. And actually the talks are available too, and many of the people who spoke at that meeting are also represented in the Lancet issue. Tim Lobstein, Vivica Craik, Terry Huang, and others as well, focusing on the issue of demand. They're a nice complement. So I would say that really what's happening to us is happening to us as a globe, globally, and that is a new frontier for all of us, and it's going to take some creativity to find the funding mechanisms to fund this kind of strategic cross-national research. So I could go into other issues that might be important for the U.S. or globally, but I think I just want to underscore how important it is that we learn from our colleagues in other countries, that we learn from the experiences, because we'll be better armed to succeed anywhere.
Well, that's great, Tracy. It really opens it up for a lot of pathways for learning. And Boyd, I'm going to turn the same question over to you. It's where do you see the next priorities?
Well, I think we definitely need to be shifting our focus upstream, up into environments and policy, and our science and research into the implementation side of things. So really a solution-oriented approach, asking how things are working, why are they working, why are they not. So it's the kind of the how questions. I think largely the what questions, what should we be doing. We've got quite a few answers to those, and the challenge at the moment is implementation. Probably the exception to that is the issue of inequalities. We need a heck of a lot more work and focus, I think, on reducing inequalities, and our targets should be about reducing childhood obesity or obesity in general, as well as reducing the inequalities. And putting those two targets together does create a big challenge. So much more of a focus on the inequalities, much more of a focus upstream and implementation science.
That's great, and yes, quite a challenge. So basically we need to just get into trenches and be working and make sure that the strategies we're using are effective, particularly where there are inequalities. Well, thank you all so much. We're going a little bit over, so I'm just going to move quickly to what's next, but this has just been wonderful. Boyd and Tracy and Terry, thank you so much. I want to just quickly mention a couple of things. First of all, Tracy, you mentioned this global presentation at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation recently, this Lessons Learned from Global Efforts, a case study, which is absolutely a fabulous paper that is available on NCCOR.org. Tracy, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, I would add that this paper does a very nice job of getting at disparities and addressing disparities, which is a central problem, of course, cross-national. The other thing I'd like to add is it also provides some insight, as I think maybe you're going to mention about an upcoming NCCOR. It also provides some insight about how we have to work with, strategize with, incentivize, use a carrots and sticks approach, whatever, with our colleagues in the food industry, because we've seen some progress, and it's really important to build on the collaborations and progress we've seen because we're not there yet. So I think that's another set of insights that you'll get from lessons learned from global efforts.
Well, thank you. And yes, just as you were mentioning, there is a seminar on March 2 in Washington, D.C. It will also be live streamed. So it's a seminar on how food executives think, so that from the public health side, we get a little bit of insight into their views on everything from profit margins to new products. So you can see on the screen that you can RSVP to MEBrown@healthyweightcommit.org. That's MEBrown@healthyweightcommit.org. And again, when you RSVP, she can tell you about the live stream as well. I know we're really looking forward to finding out a little bit more from the industry side, how we might shape some of those strategies that Boyd and Terry were talking about. I know we're out of time. Thank you for your patience. If you have other questions, you can email us at ncor@fhi360.org. And just to let you know, this, like all Connect and Explore webinars, are archived. To access the webinars, go to the Resources tab on our home page, and then to NCCOR Resources and NCCOR Webinars. And you can also stay connected by following NCCOR on Twitter and LinkedIn, visiting our blog, and signing up for our monthly e-newsletter. So please go to www.ncor.org to engage with our collaborative. And one more thing, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us and sticking with us. Before you sign off, please take a moment to complete our very brief, it's only 5-question survey that will appear on the screen immediately after this slide. Your responses really help us make sure that the webinars are what you need and what you want. So we're going to switch over to that feedback form right now. And again, thank you, and thank you, NCCOR, and all of our speakers.